Hello everyone. Today I would like to talk to you about something your parents might have said to you or something you might have said to your parents, and that is the generation gap. Many people think the generation gap is something that always exists between any two generations. There are a lot of articles and books for parents and teenagers and even children on how to overcome a generation gap. Some people use professional counseling to deal with such problems. But today, I'm going to show you a different way to think about generations, cultural change, and where you and your family fit in. In my work as a social scientist, I look at generations as specific formations in history. Each generation can be classified into categories that describes the big cultural, political, economic forces that shaped it or defined it. For example, in the United States, there are at least 7 generations that currently exist. Each of these generations has been given a label. For example, many of the leaders and politicians in the United States are from the baby boomer generation. This is a generation of children born between 1946 and 64 as part of a demographic boom after World War II ended. Another storied generation are the Millennials, born between 1981 and 1996. Millennials are also growing up quickly and taking positions of leadership. And if America is lucky, this millennial leader may become its president one day. The youngest generation in America today is Gen Alpha, born after 2012. They're certainly growing up in a very interesting time with the pandemic, schooling from home, and other unique experiences. We will perhaps see in a few years how intergenerational ties will play out between them and others. Will it be testy, like the social media swipes we see between millennials and boomers? Or will Gen Alpha prove to be a new beginning and bring us all together? Next, I want to talk about some possible generational labels for people born in India. I should mention this is my own labeling system, inspired partly from my research on youth culture and MTV in India in the 1990s. So I want to start with that generation first, trace it backwards, and finally come to the present. The liberalization generation. This is the generation that was born between 1985 and 2004 and roughly corresponds to the millennial generation. This was the first generation in modern India to grow up in a booming free market economy, consuming global youth culture through satellite channels like MTV. Although India changed in a big way in this time, sociologists found this generation did not so much rebel against the system, but actually rebelled in. They tried to balance global fashions and national pride, for example. The generation before this could be called the Indira Gandhi generation. Indira Gandhi was the Prime Minister of India for much of the time that members of this generation were growing up, roughly from 1966 to 1984. This generation also roughly corresponds to Gen X. Although democratically elected, Indira Gandhi was a powerful and domineering leader. Indian schools and colleges drilled ideals of obedience, unity, and national progress. Members of this generation also had to live through a time called the emergency. This was a time when Indira Gandhi suspended many civil liberties between 1975 and 77. The generation before this was born in a more optimistic time, though. These are people born between 1948 and 1965, roughly corresponding to boomers, and could be called the Nehruvian generation. Jawaharlal Nehru was the first Prime Minister of India. His ideas of how modern India should be a secular, scientific nation shaped the education and aspirations of this generation. Next, we move to a time when India was still a British colony. We can call those people born between 1927 and 47 the Gandhian generation. While Mahatma Gandhi himself was from an earlier generation, it was on this generation, though, that he probably had his greatest impact. This is also my parents' generation. My mother recalls to this day how she saw Mahatma Gandhi in a massive prayer meeting by the railway tracks in Tenali, modern-day Andhra Pradesh, when she was still a small child. The oldest generation, which I will cover, is the freedom generation. This includes many great philosophers, spiritual leaders, and revolutionaries born between 1857 and 1926. From the great mystic, poet, and sage Sri Aurobindo and the blissful, peaceful Ramana Maharshi, to freedom fighters like Bal Gangadhar Tilak and Bhagat Singh, to poets like Rabindranath Tagore and Subramanya Bharati, this could be said to be India's greatest generation. This generation gave the energy and the vision for India's eventual freedom. Now let's trace our way back to the present. We had the mystical freedom generation, the patriotic Gandhian generation, the nation-building Nehruvian generation, the obedient Indira Gandhi generation, and the globally connected liberalization generation. So what do we call the generation after this? Those born 2004 and afterwards, roughly corresponding to Gen Z. Some might say this generation is defined by Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Should it be called the Modi Gen? Actually, I do not think so. Although Prime Minister Modi has been in office since 2014, the current generation of children in India are growing up in a mold set very strongly under the previous government. The textbooks followed by millions of children in India in their schools continue to be those produced according to the political ideology of the previous government. Indian media also continues, for the most part, to advance the same sort of ideology. We could therefore call the generation of children growing up in India today UPA Kids. UPA stands for the United Progressive Alliance, which was a political coalition which ruled India from 2004 to 2014. It was under the stewardship of its chairman, Ms. Sonia Gandhi. And true to their name, the UPA Kids are very progressive, very idealistic, and learn about activism and protests in their schools. Will they change the world for the better? Maybe we'll know after another generation. That's all for this episode. Let me know what you think in the comments. Do you agree with my generational labels? Or would you do it differently? Let's hear your ideas, and then we can meet again with one more video, this time on stories and storytelling across the generations. Thank you.